if you want to go ahead and give a quick introduction of yourself. I know everybody met you during this last one, but for those that didn't join us during our last Facebook Live, you want to go ahead and talk a little bit about your background, about your work, where you live, and what you specialize in.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yep, for those of you who don't know, I'm Monica Smith, obviously. I am a certified recovery coach, life and recovery coach, well-being practitioner, and resilience trainer. I founded the Clear Mind Project a few years ago, which is my coaching practice. And my goal is so I work with clients individually. I also run some group programs and workshops to around all kinds of recovery and well-being topics. But my main passion and mission is to bring all of the amazing well-being, positive psychology, resilience research out there to the recovery community. I am, based on my own recovery experience, I found that there's just so many topics that don't get talked about as much in the recovery community. A lot of these topics are being applied to education and corporations and things like that, but not so much in recovery. So that's
Right.
that's my story. I don't know if that's
And
at all what I said last time, but
what's that now?
I said I have no idea what I said last time, but that's what came
Sure.
out today. So there you
It
go.
sounds pretty similar, so I think everybody will buy it. But I love the name of your program. Tell us about the 12-step, the Apply Positive Psychology 12-step program. What's the name of that and how'd that come about?
Yep. So right now it is called A Twist on the 12 Steps. We'll see if I change the name at some point in the future, but it is called A Twist on the 12 Steps, and it's basically a 12-week program, one session a week, and it's basically a well-being spin on the traditional 12 steps of recovery. So it could be either a continuation of someone who's worked the 12 steps, who kind of wants what's next, how to kind of foster relapse prevention, or kind of just continue to build thriving and well-being, or for people who are looking for something that's an alternative to traditional 12 steps. So each module focuses on a different area of positive psychology research.
Yeah, wonderful. So yeah, I remember that I heard the introduction that you gave on that CAP webinar, but I really enjoyed it. So a little bit about Monica and I, and kind of how we joined up to come together and share some of this stuff. So I recently completed a program, Certificate in Applied Positive Psychology program. And through that course, it was a 6-month course, I realized, just like Monica said, how much stuff could be applicable to and really help people in many facets of life, specifically in recovery. So I got really excited about thinking about how to bring some of that content, some of that material, and some of those resources to serving people in recovery. Through that program, through that network, I found Monica and started to learn more about her work. And through some conversations, we just got really excited about all the potential, about some of the different topics and all the things that we'd like to do to be able to serve people. We thought, a good way to do that, to really expand our reach and share some ideas that can really impact and change people's lives, is doing some of these Facebook Live videos. So we did one last month on growth mindset and how growth mindset can really serve people in recovery. And during that conversation, we brought up post-traumatic growth. So here we are tonight to talk about Monica's favorite topic, which is post-traumatic growth. For those just joining us, be sure to click in the description. If you click, you might have to click the See More button, but in the description, there's a worksheet. There's a URL where you can download a worksheet, and it's something that we'll talk about here in a little bit, but it's really designed to help you bring that post-traumatic growth, or cultivate post-traumatic growth, or learn from some experiences in your past to really make something positive or take something positive from it. So check out that worksheet. You can download it either now or later on watching a replay of this. But it's certainly a valuable resource, something you'd like to check out. And thanks for everybody who's joining us. Please go ahead and drop your name in the comment box so we can say hello to you. And as you're listening to this, if any questions come up, please think of those questions. You can share those in the comment section. We'd love to address it. That's why we're using this Facebook Live format, so that we can do some live Q&A and really help you guys in the best way that we can. So, and if you got any friends that you think might need to see this or might get value from this, and go ahead and share it. So what we're going to talk about tonight is post-traumatic growth. For those not familiar, a lot of times we talk about, we're very familiar with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. That's something that's commonly talked about. But there's also this concept of post-traumatic growth, which isn't mentioned as often, and it really isn't as we're not typically as familiar with it. So we want to talk about the difference between the two, and talk about how we can bring some of that post-traumatic growth, or some of the benefits of post-traumatic growth, or understand how post-traumatic growth comes about, so that we can experience that or leverage that in our own lives. And then we'll talk about specifically what it means for people in recovery and how they can leverage this topic of post-traumatic growth in their recovery. So Monica, since this is your favorite topic to talk about, why don't you go ahead and introduce us to, and really just explain what post-traumatic growth is for people that have never heard that term or just aren't familiar with it.
Yep, absolutely. And so I have crazy notes, so bear with me. I don't want to forget anything. So yeah, so post-traumatic growth.
If I was there,
No,
I might
I
just
really
take your notes away, because I know you could just kind of flow with it.
I can't trust my brain on the fly, so I have to like be obsessive about my notes. But anyway, yeah, so post-traumatic growth is really experiencing a positive change or a positive transformation as a result of a tragedy or a crisis or a trauma. So, and I'll talk a little bit about how that's different from resilience, because often it sort of gets lumped into resilience, and it actually really is different from resilience. It's a different concept. So one of the easy ways to think about it is that it's not just bouncing back, it's actually bouncing forward. So it's bouncing past where you originally started before the trauma, stretching far beyond that, and actually becoming sort of a better, more transformed, in a better way person. And one of the examples I like a lot that was in one of the readings I did is the idea of Spider-Man. And really, I guess you could say many superheroes, because they all sort of have this backstory of something terrible happening, and then they come away with superpowers. But they talk about Spider-Man being bit by a radioactive spider, and which is, you know, gross and yucky and horrible. But he comes away with superpowers. And so I like that example, because resilience would be healing from the bite, and sort of being restored into a normal healing, just healing the bite. But instead, he actually comes away with superpowers as a result of that. So Superman's my like example of post-traumatic growth, and maybe on my tattoo list at some point for a reminder. So,
so you're saying people with greater resilience. Yeah, so people that have greater resilience will have a greater tendency towards post-traumatic growth by PTSD.
It's actually very, very interesting. We'll kind of skip ahead. So I'll talk about how post-traumatic growth relates to resilience and post-traumatic stress disorder. So really, and I wish I had a visual for this, but if everybody can just imagine the traditional bell curve. So that's kind of the best way to think about it. So you have kind of the big bell in the middle, and you have the outskirts on the left side and the outskirts on the right side. There you go. Thank you. Perfect. Yay. So on the left side,
but it's close enough.
See, you know, we're such a good team. So, you know, on one of the small ends is PTSD. So people who experience really extended distress symptoms for a long period of time, that interfere with their lives, interfere with their families, their work. That's PTSD, and we're really pretty familiar with that concept out there. So that's kind of the small portion on the left. The big, huge bell part is resilience, which is just traditional bouncing back. Like you have an adversity, it sucks for a while, you may experience temporary depression, anxiety, but you bounce back to where you started, and you're kind of restored to where you were before. And then the small portion on the right is post-traumatic growth. So that's, again, you're not experiencing traditional resilience. You're actually bouncing way forward beyond resilience. So the interesting thing that the research shows, and this is why I think this is super exciting news for recovery, which I'm really way jumping ahead, but it doesn't matter. Is that the people who are most likely to experience post-traumatic growth are the people that were the least resilient before the trauma.
Really?
And the reason is, yes, and the reason is because post-traumatic growth requires someone to be rocked at their core, to actually have their whole story of life, their whole kind of identity shattered. Because post-traumatic growth is really a redefinition of who you are, what your priorities are, your sense of meaning and purpose in life, your relationships being redefined, maybe your sense of spirituality being refined. So those are some of the qualities that happen. So for people who are just generally resilient, they kind of typically don't drop low enough to experience the height. It's sort of like you need to go low to go high, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So
So
I
if it
think,
doesn't rock you to your core to the point that you really question your core beliefs, the fundamentals of life, the foundational things that you live and live and breathe by, if it doesn't rock all that, because either you're too resilient or it wasn't traumatic enough, I guess, then it can't foster this post-traumatic growth.
exactly. So here's another image that may help with that. They talk about the idea of the shattered vase. Vase. I don't know, everybody says it different. But this idea, so, you know, if you pretend you had this beautiful vase in your house and you loved it and you had it there for a million years and one day you knock it over, something knocks it over, sometimes it'll break in like 3 big chunks, and it breaks in such a way that you can glue it back together. It's, you know, only a couple chunks and you piece it back together. There's no little tiny shards. It fits all back together nicely. You put it back together. Nobody ever knows it broke. You're good. So that would be resilience. You know, it fell, it broke, you put it back together the way it was. So alternatively, the vase could shatter into thousands and thousands of pieces to the point where it doesn't matter how long you spend, you're never going to be able to piece it back together to what it was. It's never going to be the vase that it was. So, but you can take all those shards and you can turn it into a mosaic. You can build something new with it, right? So that's post-traumatic growth. So it's kind of this idea that something has to be shattered and almost unrecognizable in order to make something new out of it, which is why the people that are the least resilient are actually the most likely candidates for post-traumatic growth.
That makes sense. But you're certainly not suggesting that we don't foster resilience and work on our resilience.
No, okay. I'm not suggesting that. And in fact, this is a good time for me to interject because the one thing that I think we all have to be careful about, and this is delicate, is that, you know, talking about post-traumatic growth, it's my favorite topic, as you know. I'm super excited about it. But it is not saying that trauma isn't real. It's not saying that PTSD isn't real. And really, it's really important to emphasize that nobody should be skipping over processing trauma to try to let's just do the growth part. Let's forget about all of the processing. That would be great if that was possible, but you know, it's definitely important to make sure that everyone understands that it's important to process trauma. It's important to go through the emotions, to get help, to go through all that stuff. It's just also important to know that that's only part of the story. And I think that's where sometimes we can fall short because this doesn't get talked about as much. Post-traumatic growth doesn't get talked about as much. And so people don't even necessarily know that it's possible.
And I think that's a big point, though, is it just knowing that there is such a thing can plant that seed of hope for somebody who has gone through a traumatic experience. But to your point, that's not to say you don't really still have to process the trauma and still really deal with the effects of that trauma. But there is something other than PTSD. There is something other than living in the cloud and the shame and the guilt or whatever it is, whatever manifests from that trauma. There is another option. And I think just understanding that there is another option can be enough to help inspire that hope so people can move beyond it. But like you said, I mean, but moving beyond trauma is not just something that you can do. Just because there is this concept or this idea of post-traumatic growth, it doesn't just mean that you get to kind of pick and choose and that's it. Like you're just like, oh, I'm going to choose growth on this one. It's not that easy. Just like moving beyond depression is not like, hey, just don't be depressed. Like think happy thoughts and you won't be depressed anymore. It's not that easy. It is possible. And knowing that can inspire hope, but you still got to deal with it. You still got to do the work.
Exactly. And it kind of reminds me, and that's why I think it's a sensitive thing that's worth mentioning, because what I don't want is for anybody that's kind of in a yucky place or not really fully having processed the trauma yet to be then beating themselves up for the fact that they're not in growth yet, you know, or whatever. It takes the time it takes. And, you know, it reminds me of anybody who has ever participated in one of my group programs will probably laugh at this because it is without fail, I give a strengths assessment in one of my modules, and without fail, every group member that I've had so far and even individual clients, they will get their list of 24 strengths, and the first thing everybody does is they flip to the very end of the list and they look at their bottom strengths.
Yeah.
And they say, oh my gosh, why is forgiveness number 24 my strengths? And it becomes this tool to beat ourselves up, because that's sort of our default sometimes, is like beating ourselves up for not being in a different place than we are, or why are we taking so long? So, and I'm like, these are strengths. This is not a list of like what's wrong with you, but it's just that our natural tendency is to do that. And so I think, as much as I want people to know that post-traumatic growth is like such a good news story, and if you feel like you're a person who's struggled your whole life, there's so much hope for you, because you're more likely to experience post-traumatic growth than everybody else if you really struggled. But I don't want people to come away thinking, well, something's wrong with me if I haven't gotten there yet, or think that they can skip over the crappy part, because unfortunately that's not how it works either. I wish it was.
Yeah. And also, just for people to understand, just because there is an alternative or another possible outcome than PTSD, it's not another way to look at other people that are dealing with PTSD and like, oh, just kind of come out of it, and why don't you pursue that post-traumatic growth stuff? I mean, it's not that easy of a switch, and it's not that easy of a solution. But once again, for loved ones dealing with people that are experiencing that PTSD and experiencing the consequences of trauma in their life, it can provide us that hope so that we can feel a little bit more empowered to be there and hold space for somebody, realizing that there could be, a positive outcome from it if, with the right processing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think they talk about the fact that tragedy, despite all of its negative consequences, it really does create space for us to redefine ourselves. And when I think about my own life and my own experiences, there are so many things that I am so grateful for that I have now that I really honestly don't know that I would have gotten without tragedy. I don't know. There are certain skills that I have that I probably wouldn't have gotten otherwise, and there are strengths that I have that I don't know that I would have paid attention to. So it's just that it creates a space that wouldn't otherwise be there. And it's important to, again, this kind of goes back to mindset, which is why I think post-traumatic growth came up in mindset, is
right.
if we have the bigger perspective and we understand that, research shows that adversity is actually a really necessary component for well-being and for flourishing. So, and adversity creates a lot of psychological suffering, right? So it's kind of like holding those two opposing ideas at the same time, that adversity creates suffering and adversity right. is necessary for thriving.
Yeah. And it's back to that, if the trauma is big enough and your resilience is low enough so that the event or the experience really shakes everything to the core and brings everything down, then you get the opportunity to rebuild something much stronger and much different than before. So I like that. So we talked about who experiences PTG, post-traumatic growth. So what are some of if you want to talk about some of the elements of post-traumatic growth, what it can look like, what it can mean for people, how it shows up, what it'll look like if they're experiencing it.
Yep, absolutely. So the research that's gone on around this has really found 5 key elements or 5 key themes that people who experience this bouncing forward seem to all have in common as a result of adversity or trauma. And so they are, let me read my little list here. They are a greater appreciation for life and a different and greater sense of priority. So more of a better mindset about what are the priorities in life. Closer and warmer relationships, so improved closeness with people, improved intimacy with good relationships. A greater sense of personal strength. Which makes sense, obviously. Having the capacity to kind of forge a new path, or identifying a new sense of potential in life, kind of changing path or changing focus, and then a greater sense of spirituality and kind of what I would lump into spirituality there is like a greater sense of meaning, a greater sense of purpose in life. So those are kind of the 5 key elements that really seem to come through for people who experience post-traumatic growth. And it's a good sort of self-check inventory of maybe, maybe you're someone who really has come away and processed the trauma, and maybe you've experienced post-traumatic growth and you don't even know it.
Sure.
And you can like listen to that list and check yourself, hey, whoa, I've experienced it and I didn't even know. But, I think there's probably a lot of people walking around that don't even know that they've experienced post-traumatic growth, but they would kind of fall into those categories.
Sure. And I'm sure looking back, they could identify those qualities or that perspective shift. They could identify the point where it happened, whereas they might not have realized that a chapter, an experience, or an event was as significant or as traumatic to them as it was. And I see on your
absolutely.
Yeah, I see on your notes it talks about why growth. So like why does it create growth? Why does an experience create growth? And kind of like you said, it's your first note says prior assumptions are shattered. So assumptions that we had about life, assumptions that we had about experiences, priorities, whatever it is, shatters. I remember an experience that was really and it's funny that we're talking about this as I'm processing it right now. I guess this experience to me was traumatic, or the events leading up to it were traumatic, because I can remember a specific chapter in my life, the first half of 2013, that really I experienced all of these things: greater appreciation of life and changed sense of priorities, warmer, more intimate relationships, a greater sense of personal strength, that spiritual growth and recognition of new possibilities. So when I left for my last deployment to Afghanistan in 2013, I was at, as I tell everybody, I was at a terrible place in my life. My life was defined by stress, by anxiety. I lost a lot of the sense of purpose that I had in the work that I was doing. I didn't have as much joy in it. I looked at my life and how it was really kind of falling apart around me. Relationships were having issues. I wasn't as engaged in the work that I was doing. I didn't find the sense of purpose that I once had. I was challenged, spiritually challenged, religiously challenged, personally challenged, and my life was really just stress, anxiety, and constant panic and confusion. And I came to the conclusion that one of two things was true about life. Either life was supposed to be this miserable experience that we just suffered through for many, many years and then we passed away, or, and I was hoping it was this other option, that some basic fundamentals about life, some beliefs that I had about life and about how the world works and about how we're supposed to engage and how we're supposed to show up was completely wrong. And I'd made some just wrong assumptions. So through this 6-month experience, I think maybe all the kind of the trauma was leading up to that point, but through the 6 months, I spent a lot of time reading everything I could, watching every video that I could, every Google Talk and TED Talk, and going to different religious sermons and reading different texts and trying to find answers to what had I gotten so wrong that had put me in this position, and holding that space and holding that for that opportunity that maybe some of my most fundamental beliefs and fundamental thoughts about what life meant and how we're supposed to live and show up in the world, just realizing that maybe those were wrong allowed me to see that opportunity. So all those prior assumptions that I had were shattered. There are a lot of things about, what was important, how do we act, how do we interact, how do we engage in the things that we do, assumptions that I had that were all shattered. And through that process, to your next point about why growth, says humans are wired to find meaning. And this is a big thing that comes up for me when I think about post-traumatic growth. We all try to find meaning for those things that happen in our life. We all want to know, why did this happen? What was the meaning of that? Why, how is this useful in my life? And we seek meaning because it helps us kind of maybe feel like we understand, or maybe feel like there's some hope that we could control things. So we're always trying to find meaning. And one of the biggest differences that I've seen in between post-traumatic growth and post-traumatic stress disorder is whether somebody can find meaning from that traumatic event. If something happens to us and we think that there was no meaning for it whatsoever, that it was just some cruel act of the world, or some cruel act of a creator trying to punish us in some way, or just something that unfairly happened to us, and we can find no meaning from it, then it tends to lead towards the stress disorder and the anxiety and the panic and all the negative consequences, all the negative manifestations of that post-traumatic experience. But if we can look back and understand, if we can identify some of those things that we gained, some of the strengths that we gained, some of the new realizations, some of the new spiritual appreciations that came from it, and we can see how that changed our trajectory for the positive, either brought new opportunities, brought new people, brought new awarenesses, brought new assumptions, brought new strengths into our life, and we can identify the meaning from it, then that sets us up and can tend us towards that post-traumatic growth, because we can use that meaning to, kind of help inspire us towards the more positive manifestations in that that post-traumatic experience. Does that kind of line up with what you've seen and what you understand?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can, just kind of along the lines of what you're saying, when I think about, so I need to come back to meaning. So now I got to hold these two things in my head so I don't forget. But the one thing I wanted to say, in terms of kind of belief systems, one of the things I found, and I think many people could probably relate to, you end up experiencing these same patterns of things. You have these same patterns of experiences over and over again, and they may like look kind of different, but they end up really feeling very similar. And they're like, for me, a lot of it was relationships. I kept experiencing the same kind of relationship issues with all these different people, and I was feeling the same. And my beliefs were really, over time, and I want to really get to the loved ones, to the partners and loved ones of those in recovery, because this is also good news for them. I was really having people in my life in recovery. There was a lot of betrayal trauma, and there was a lot of my own. There was trauma from my experiences of being a loved one, and it really shattered my beliefs about other people and relationships and what people are supposed to be like, and what I'm supposed to be like. And it forced me to really evaluate what was I expecting other people to do for me versus what was I supposed to be doing for myself. And really that is how, one of the main ways I came to post-traumatic growth was it forced me. I mean, it really forced me, because believe me, I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to go through all that pain. I didn't want to reevaluate. I didn't want to deal with what is self-care and what is self-nurturing, and that's uncomfortable, and I don't want to do it, and it's easier to focus on everybody else and what their problems are. But it forced me, the trauma forced me, to my knees to say, you have to figure out how to take care of these things yourself. And that was a huge gift, but it was a belief system that was shattered. So the story I tell myself about why that happened is it happened so that I could learn. It's one of these things I talk to clients about all the time. What if the story is that you've been abandoned so that you can learn to stop abandoning yourself? And
Wow.
does that make abandonment less painful?
Well, yeah. I mean, if you're showing up for yourself, I think we lost you for a second. We lost you for a second. Were you getting a phone call? Something coming in?
No,
All right, we got you back.
now I don't know how to make it right side up.
Oh, you're good right now in our view. Okay.
Okay.
No,
Are you sure?
Yep, you're good. That's a great
Okay.
example, and we talked
All right.
about that a little bit earlier today. But I think and this stuff can show up in our life in so many different ways. But that the betrayal trauma, again, it's something that redefines much of our belief system. I think back to some of the work I've done with Jack Canfield, and he talks about taking responsibility for the outcomes in our life. And he says an event happens and then we respond to an event, but it's the way that we respond to it that ultimately determines our outcome. And as you were saying, if you have, the same events or the same circumstances keep happening and you keep responding in the same way, you're going to keep seeing that same outcome. And I think through this, traumatic experience where it can shatter our belief systems, shatter the way that we naturally respond to an event, then after that experience, if we change our responses, then we can start to see different outcomes. But something else you said really resonated with me, that tendency to lean into service and lean into caring about other people. And it really, it makes me think, that's our same propensity towards escaping, numbing, avoiding, doing these things that to fill a void in us. A lot of people that have struggled with substance use disorder or addiction, it's because they've created this habit of responding to pain, to suffering, to confusion, to avoid it inside, just whatever that uncomfortable situation is inside. We've created a habit of responding to it in one particular way. So whether that's with a substance or whether that's with a behavior, it's for the same reason. And if our behavior is I had this void inside, whether it's a self-efficacy void, a self-esteem void, a sense of worth or a sense of value, or a need for validation, a need for confirmation that we respond to by leaning into service and caring for other people to get the attention off of us and maybe make us feel good because we're caring for other people. Well, we're also abandoning ourselves in the process. We're not recognizing our needs. We're not taking care of ourselves, and we're abandoning, our core for the service of other people in an unhealthy way. So when we're betrayed by other people, it really shatters that whole structure, that whole foundation, and brings us really crashing down to that point where we're nothing but dust, and now we have to rebuild, and can hopefully do it in a way that we're rebuilding stronger with those better habits of self-care and self-nurturing.
Yep, absolutely. And, kind of the point that you were starting to make about how important meaning is, it is the story we tell ourselves about what happened to us and why it happened that matters more than probably anything else. It is the story, and we tell ourselves so many stories. And there's a great TED Talk out there, and of course, I can't think of the name of it. I can't think of her name, but it's called The Danger of a Single Story. So I highly recommend that people, check that TED Talk out, because it really talks about how powerful our stories can be that we tell ourselves, and we really have to, as hard as it is, really pay attention to what's going on, what's the noise in there. And, because as I've been betrayed and as I've been abandoned and as I've been neglected and as these things have happened, I've had to ask myself, is my story that I deserved it? Is my story that, everybody's always going to treat me this way for the rest of my life? Is the story that it's hopeless and I'm a victim? What is my story? Or is my story that the universe is giving me these situations in order to force me to learn how to nurture myself, in order to force me to learn how to stand on my own 2 feet, and and to love myself kind of in a deeper way. And that is the story I choose today, but it wasn't always the case, So
yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, and we got it, but and that's the thing is, we've got to learn to kind of find that story. And when we're marching along in life and everything's going okay, then maybe we don't have as much compassion for ourselves. Our world gets rocked, and it takes a lot of awareness. It takes effort. It takes doing this work. It takes close friends that are there to really support you, so that your mind doesn't go to that place. And this happens to me. This happened to me recently. That my mind goes to that place that this happened to me because I deserved it. This happened to me because the best version of myself still deserves to be betrayed. Still deserves to not have that, that love or that connection or that respect in my life. And that's the story that, pops up. But it's, you got to recognize that, have compassion for yourself, hold that space so that you can remind yourself, this happened for a good reason. I mean, everything in life, I think, happens for us, not against us. And whether that was to, rock you to your core so that you could rebuild with a new belief system or new habits, or it was, the universe looking out for you and trying to take somebody out of your life that you never would have come around to, to take out of your life, or to move beyond, or to restructure the structure of that relationship. If you weren't able to do it yourself, then maybe that's why you came to this crossroads. But either way, it happened for your good. And I did, while you were talking, I popped the link, the hyperlink to that TED Talk in the comments. So for anybody that's catching the replay, you can just click that when it's done.
Awesome. Yeah. No, and sometimes I talk, speaking of kind of staying on the topic of meaning for a second in the story, it's this idea that I talk about sometimes with, if you lived your entire life in a white room, you would have no idea the room was white.
Sure.
Because you wouldn't have experienced any contrast to know the difference. And so I think sometimes it's really easy to get really bogged down in all of the really negative, horrible stuff that's real, the pain and the suffering and the trauma and the wounds. And again, this particularly is relevant to recovery, because recovery is this process of, really digging up old wounds and looking at them and shedding all these layers. And it can be really hard I guess I should say, it can be easy to lose sight of like the big picture of, you can get really stuck in that place. But it is through contrast that we learn. And I know you and I were talking earlier this morning about the idea of like, you can want to become a great tennis player and you can read books about tennis and you can watch videos, but until you pick up a tennis racket and go practice in the court, you're not going to become a good tennis player by watching and thinking about it and pontificating and ruminating. So if we want well-being, if we want to be fulfilled, if we want to have thriving relationships, we have to pick up the racket. And unfortunately, that's going to involve, you know, bad games and injuries and all kinds of stuff. But if we can figure out the bigger story of why, why I'm going through this betrayal, why I'm experiencing, well, it's given me an opportunity to practice a skill. It's given me an opportunity to learn something about myself. It's forcing me to take care of myself because I'm in crisis and I need self-care. You know, it's forcing all these things on me that I may not have otherwise done. And yeah, it still sucks. And I still need to take care of my emotions, but I can also take care of my emotions and keep the story in perspective. And I just think that's a huge part of, I mean, if we could summarize the most important thing about post-traumatic growth, it is really kind of coming away with keeping the story in perspective.
Oh, I love that. And this is so important for people in the topic of addiction or in the topic of living in recovery or substance use disorder, because a lot of the research shows that there's a very close correlation between trauma and later manifestations of addiction or substance misuse. I think Dr. Gabor Mate says that every addiction can be traced back to trauma, either a traumatic event or some like developmental trauma that people experience. And when we're looking back at our life and trying to make meaning of those things that happen in our life, if the meaning that we come up with and the story that we tell ourselves is always the negative one, then it's always going to repeat that pattern of digging that hole, opening up that void, kind of holding us down, wearing down our self-efficacy. And that's only putting us in a place that's going to further fuel those cravings and further fuel those negative habits that we learned as coping mechanisms. But if we can reframe that and learn how to use some of these ideas and this concept and just holding space, just keeping hope alive that the trauma from the past doesn't always have to play out the same way and that your future is not always going to be defined the same because of that trauma in the past. You can't go back and change that traumatic experience or that traumatic event, but you can change, and this goes back to the growth mindset, you can change how you continue to look at it today, how you process that trauma today when you look back over it, when you're looking back at the things that you face in your life, and create a new path for the future or change course for the future.
Yep, absolutely. I totally agree. And I put in big bold letters in my notes, why does this matter for recovery? And I know we're already touching on this, but the most important message for me is that the struggle, so as it relates to post-traumatic growth, the struggle is the necessary ingredient, that it is required to be rocked to your core in order to experience post-traumatic growth. And so that is people who find themselves in recovery, whether it's because they love someone who's in recovery or struggling with addiction, or whether they're struggling with it themselves. There is no other place that is more rocking to the core, I think, than that. And so it's just, I just want people to know that there is hope if that is where they find themselves, especially as it relates to post-traumatic growth.
I love that. So I wrote down, and I'm going to quote you on this later, a struggle is the necessary ingredient for growth. Is that how you'd say it?
Yes.
All right, I love that.
Yeah. I like it.
Very cool. So what can people do with all this? I don't know if you want to comment. Was there anything else, any big points before we kind of wrap up and talk about the worksheet?
No, the worksheet's great.
So we talked about post-traumatic growth, the difference between post-traumatic growth, post-traumatic stress disorder. You correlated to a bell curve, saying that people go through trauma throughout their life, and on one side of the bell curve is that PTSD manifestation of dealing with that trauma. But that's not the only place that people can go with very severe trauma. The other place people can go and experience is that post-traumatic growth. And one thing that really probably surprises a lot of people is the people that can experience that post-traumatic growth most likely are those that were less resilient in the beginning. Sometimes I think of resiliency as like a rubber band, and if the rubber band is brittle or if it's string and it has no elasticity to it, then that's very low resilience. If you pull on it, it's going to break. That's it. If you are very resilient, then you can pull on it. It's got heavy elasticity, and you can stretch it. And that elasticity is your resilience, your ability to come back to normal after a traumatic experience. But if you come back to normal after the traumatic experience, then you don't experience either the PTSD or the post-traumatic growth. But if that experience is extreme enough, that trauma is extreme enough, then it can break that string or tear that rubber band to the point that it's no longer represents what it was, and now it's in pieces and now has to be rebuilt into something completely new. When we rebuild it into something completely new and it's positive, then that's what's post-traumatic growth. And it's when we have greater appreciation of life and sense of priorities. It shows up as warmer or more intimate relationships. And if you're listening, these sound exactly the opposite of what PTSD manifestations would look like. So the negative correlation of this would define PTSD. But in the positive aspect, a greater sense of personal strength. So realizing that we've overcome a trauma, it didn't kill us, and it strengthened us in some way. Recognition of new possibilities. As we change our beliefs, as we change our habits, we recognize that new outcomes can come out of those same events that we face in our life, and we experience some spiritual development or a sense of spiritual growth. So that's what PTSD and post-traumatic growth sound like, and what resilience has to do with it. Those people that are most likely to experience it are those with the least resilience, or those that are rocked so hard by a trauma that it redefines some of those core belief systems. It matters a lot for recovery because everybody that's facing substance misuse, substance use disorder, or living in active addiction, or has once lived in active addiction, there's a tight correlation between that habit or that behavioral pattern and some trauma that you faced earlier in your life. So having these tools, having that the idea of post-traumatic growth and the understanding that it's even an option can really empower us to change for the future. And that's the biggest thing for me with post-traumatic growth, is just understanding that there is such a thing as post-traumatic growth. And if you are on that side of the bell curve as PTSD, or that trauma is continuing to create negative effects in your life, it doesn't always have to be that way. There is another option there, and just knowing that can kind of plant that seed and help you find or direct your path towards that better option. So how can we foster post-traumatic growth, and how can we build that post-traumatic growth in our life? Any pointers on that? Besides the worksheet
so
people can download?
Yes, I highly recommend the worksheet because it covers a lot of these different areas. But one of the things I think is a great thing for people to know about is this idea of redemptive narrative. So there have been some really interesting studies that look at, we all are kind of familiar with, like, okay, journal out your feelings, like write out what happened, talk, get your journal out and talk about your feelings. And that can be powerful for some people, but there's some interesting research that looks at that it's actually way more effective to write a narrative, to write a story, beginning, middle, and end, and to make sure the end is very redemptive in nature. It sort of shows you coming away this transformed person, even if you're not there yet, even if you're right in the middle of it. To write this redemptive story about yourself is actually really effective. So it's an activity that I would recommend doing, just on a rainy Saturday, maybe. Write your life story from a redemptive perspective. It's a great activity to do.
And I've heard some recommendations for doing that in the third person. Do you find value in doing that in the third? Does it help, like, provide that separation so that maybe we can come to a more positive conclusion?
Yeah, I think maybe sometimes the third person helps us get a little bit of distance from it and see it from a different, from a different perspective. It's kind of like when you have people who are doing inner child work. Sometimes it's too hard for them to think about themselves, their own inner child, but they can think about another child,
Sure.
Their child or a child they know. So I think sometimes getting some distance allows you to tell the story in a different way. So yeah,
Right.
That's a great activity for sure.
So very cool. So a redemptive narrative. And what are some other things? Or I can just kind of read through this worksheet if you'd like.
Yeah, sure.
So for anybody who's downloaded the worksheet or does, you'll see that there's exercises for dealing with traumatic experiences. The first thing is How have you grown as a result of the experience? Now, you can do that either in a redemptive narrative, as we just discussed, or just look in your life, look at before traumatic experience, after traumatic experience. Don't look at the ways that you're affected negatively, but try to identify some ways that you are affected positively. What have you learned? What new skills have you learned? What new relationships do you have now? What relationships do you not have now that, that might have been hampering or been toxic in your life? What new compassion do you have? What new understanding? What new belief systems do you have? But what has changed for the positive since that traumatic experience? And then it kind of gets into more detail in this worksheet. So did any of your relationships strengthen, and how? What things in life do you now appreciate more? What do you know now, or what do you now know that you didn't before? What are things that you learned either about people, about an experience, about an environment, about a certain situation? What do you know now that you didn't know before? And if you want to take that a little bit further, how can you use what you know now that you didn't know before for some positive effect or some positive benefit in your life? The next question, have you grown to value, what have you grown to value in life that you didn't before? For me, going through that, I guess that transformational experience in 2013, there were a lot of things that I started to value that I never really, put much stock in before. So, but as I looked through and really challenged some of my beliefs and challenged some of my understandings and the fundamentals that I thought were leading me in life to, to the life that I wanted to experience, when I started to challenge those, I reordered a lot of the values that I had. And what strengths do you now have that you didn't have before? And what opportunities are now available that weren't before? So if you lost, if some traumatic event happened and you lost your house, you had to move to a new city, you lost a car, you lost you went through a bankruptcy, you lost a relationship, or a physical trauma or something happened to you and it caused, a change of trajectory in your life. Well, now what opportunities do you have available for you that weren't available to you before? You look at a lot of people that work with people either in a growth capacity, or I'm sure that you can say most of the people that you've met through professional recovery coaching, they all have some experience with some trauma in their life that set them on a course to prepare them for the work that they're doing. So that's an opportunity that came, and a lifestyle that came, or a life work that came from that traumatic experience. So that's one kind of opportunity that has shown up, I'm sure, with hundreds of others. And then this is an important thing at the end is, what advice would you give to somebody now who's facing that same situation? So the situation that you faced in the past, if you were telling a friend how you could process that, or how you could get through that, what advice would you tell to a friend? Again, this is kind of moving you to that third person, giving you a little bit of distance so you can look at it more objectively, and see some of that positive. It's, they say if you're in the bottle, it's hard to see the label on the bottle, but if you can kind of come out of the bottle, or if you're in the painting, it's hard to see the whole picture. But if you step back from the whole picture, then you can find the positive, find the value, find the meaning. So coming to that third person can be really helpful. Any other thoughts or anything that you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think that those are great. Those are really great kind of reflective exercises that I think will be really helpful for people. Other things they talk about are kind of trying to find meaningful activities to engage in. So, and I think this kind of makes intuitive sense, but, thinking about like volunteering, or taking a class, or finding a project, or, finding something that you really feel in the flow, or like to do, or that piques your interest. So kind of getting involved, engaged in something, trying to really enhance high quality connections in your life. So either enhancing existing relationships you have that are good, or developing some new ones if the ones you have aren't so good, but really focusing on connecting with people, are other things. Creating new habits. I mean, creating new habits fixes so many things in life, doesn't it?
Sure.
So kind of creating new habits, and well, first of all, definitely asking for help, because that's kind of part of making connections. What else?
And that can be a habit that we are not used to doing. Is just, okay, let me stop struggling through this alone. Let me reach out and ask for help. Maybe that's the one new habit, or the one change that you can make that can make a huge difference.
Exactly. And then, really this is more of a practice thing, but kind of to our whole entire point, it's really listening to the mind chatter,
Yeah.
Listen to what's going on in your head more often, because It's scary once you figure that out. It's scary
True.
once you're like, oh my God, these are the stories that are going on in there. It's a lot of noise, you know, but if you can become more in tune with what the noise is saying, you really can learn to question it more often. So those are kind of the high level activities to talk about to kind of foster post-traumatic growth.
Very cool. Well, awesome.
Yeah.
If you're watching a replay of this, for anybody has any, well, anybody has any questions that's listening now, please go ahead and drop them in the comments and we'll try to address them before we jump off here. But for anybody catching the replay, also leave any questions that you have in the comments, or you can send me an email or message me on Facebook. I'd love to get your questions, hear your comments, and reply or help in any way that I can. If you want to learn some more about Monica's work, there's a link to her website in the comments. It's the Clear Mind Project. You can go to clearmindproject.com to find out more about her work and connect with her. If you haven't done so, I invite you to join the Facebook group for those people in recovery to help empower people in recovery to live happier and more fulfilling lives. It's called A Life Unchained, and there's a link to that Facebook page in the comments as well. But I really appreciate everybody for showing up and checking out this Facebook Live. I look forward to many more coming, hopefully with Monica joining me for every single one. But some topics I want to talk about in the future. One is dealing with guilt and resentment. Another one is changing habits and just doing some things that we can engage more in life, and then focusing a little bit more on achievement, whether it's taking another look at goal setting, which would be timely, you know, in the first of the year, or some other things like using feedback and some, you know, some ways that we can deal with emotions or some obstacles that we have so that we can lean into and achieve more of those things that are meaningful to us. But if you don't have anything else to add, Monica, I want to thank everybody for showing up. I'll be sharing this post, and I invite anybody who's watching this to share this post with your friends and provide us any feedback that you've got. We love you guys, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video. Thank you, Monica, for everything.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.